Hey, y'all. I'm happy to be here. My name is Larry Thompson. I'm a storyteller from over in Seguin, Texas, over there at the Honeydew Ranch. I'd like to be with you in person, but with all this Corona stuff, we're all staying locked down close to home. So I'm going to record a little something for you. One of my most favorite Texas cowboy tales, uh, really any kind of tale that comes out of Texas is going to be one of my favorites. But Uh, this one here is well, it's about a fellow named Bigfoot Wallace. Now, some of y'all may have heard of Bigfoot Wallace before, but if you haven't, let me set the stage now. Bigfoot Wallace, they called him that because, of course, he had big feet. And, well, having big feet meant that he was tall. He is over 6 foot 4 inches tall, and those big feet, well, they were most often clad in big old leather boots. Sometimes he'd have on some big moccasins, but most of the time has big old leather boots. He always had with him his best friend, Butch, which was a big old hunting knife. Imagine that, giving yourself a hunting knife with a name like Butch. And right beside Butch, well, you'd always find him with his second best friend that he called Sweet Lips. Now, that was a big old black powder rifle, long rifle that he used. And Sweet Lips was a real interesting name for it because he would often say, well, nobody really liked to get kissed by Sweet Lips, if you know what I mean. A big old rifle, no, sir. But Bigfoot Wallace, he was a Texas Ranger. He was a frontiersman. He was a cowboy. He was a homesteader. Uh, he was known throughout the entire state. This would have been, oh, in the early days of Texas, 1840s, somewhere around there. And it seems old Bigfoot had him a spread out on the west of San Antonio, out in the Medina Basin out there. And he had himself a little cabin and a bunch of ponies that he had staked out. And he would raise those ponies and he would sell them to cowboys and farmers who needed horses. That was one of his side businesses. But one evening, he had about 40 or so of them ponies tied up outside his cabin. And wouldn't you know, some Comanche raiders came through. They cut through his fence in the middle of the night. They were so quiet, even the dogs didn't wake up. When Bigfoot got up in the morning, he looked outside. All them ponies was gone. Well, all but one, his most favorite ride. He called her White Bean. Now, he called her White Bean because he was once he was in a gambling match of sorts, and you had to draw a bean from a bag, and the white bean meant life, and the black bean meant death. He was lucky enough to grab the white bean, and ever since then, he wanted to remember it. So he commemorated that white bean by naming his favorite pony White Bean. Well, he got old Butch strapped on around his waist and he grabbed old Sweet Lips and he stepped outside of his cabin. He walked around the backside where he'd had old White Bean tied up. He got her loose, put on a saddle and a bridle. He walked around to the front side. He noticed all the footprints on the ground. They were moccasin prints, so he knew very well they'd been Comanche raiders that had come and taken his ponies. And there was so many of them and they left so many tracks. Well, even a greenhorn could have followed them, but an expert tracker like Bigfoot, he didn't have no trouble at all. He jumped on the White Bean and they headed off following them tracks. And they got a little ways away from the cabin and he got to be a little nervous with himself, thinking what he was going to do if he did find those fellas. And but you can't let somebody steal all them ponies from you. So he kept on tracking them. He came into this little little wooded area down there right along the river. And he got himself down off that pony White Bean real quiet like, and he stepped in amongst them trees. Now them trees was hickory trees, and it was just the right time of year for those hickory nuts to be just fresh and plump. They was all over the ground. And every time he'd brush against a tree, another passel would fall down. He scouted around a bit. He came across a little wide open spaces in the trees, and he could look straight ahead, and he seen the smoke from that Comanche fire. He knew he was close. He still didn't really have a plan, and he stepped back and leaned against one of those trees again, and one of those dang hickory nuts, they fell right down, went right straight down his shirt collar, and then he had himself an idea. Now, Bigfoot was a big fella for sure. And one thing people always noticed about him was that he always wore his clothes real loose. So he got himself a few pieces of leather, and he tied them real tight around his waist to round up shirt right there. And he tied this one around this part of his shirt, and he opened up the front like this, and he began to shake the tree. And as the tree shook, why, he would catch these hickory nuts all inside. They'd fall into his shirt. And then he opened up like this, and he began to push them on down into his sleeves. Pretty soon his entire shirt was filled with them fresh hickory nuts. He got some leather strand, he tied off the bottom of his pants where his boots was, and he began to stuff hickory nuts down into his pants legs. He put them down the back of his shirt, he put them in the front, he collared himself up real tight. These days, we'd say he looked kind of like a Michelin man. He was so full up with them hickory nuts. Why, he even took off his hat and loaded it with hickory nuts and then screwed it down on his head real tight. He grabbed old Sweet Lips. She had one shot in her ready to go, like any black powder rifle should have. And he made sure Butch was right there by his side. And he slowly made his way into the clearing where those Comanche was around their fire. He stood there silent for just a minute, and then he raised up old Sweet Lips, and he took aim, and he just popped a shot off right into the middle of them. And when they turned around to see where that shot came from, he just stood up at his full height, and he raised his arms high as he could, and he said, "Give me back my ponies." Well, I tell you what, those Comanche turned around, and the first thing happened, their mouths fell open. They didn't know if they was looking at some kind of monster. They didn't know they was looking at some kind of a being from some other realm. They didn't know what it was. They sure didn't suspect it was old Bigfoot Wallace. Well, he said it again loud as he could, "Give me back my ponies." But you know those Comanche, they're so good with them bows and arrows. They didn't think twice. First one of them picked up a bow and an arrow, and he fired it, and it was a direct hit, right square in the center of Bigfoot Wallace's chest. But it didn't go in. It hit one of them hickory nuts and just went beak and hit the ground. Well, that took that Comanche by surprise. He pulled up another arrow and he fired it. Beep, hit the ground. And Bigfoot Wallace just stood there. "Oh, give me back my ponies." Every one of them Comanche picked up their bow and their arrow, and they began to fire. They would hit, beep, and fall to the ground. Beep, fall to the ground. Beep, fall to the ground. A couple of them even hit him in his head. Beep, fall to the ground. They hit him in his leg. Beep, fall to the ground. Well, there weren't no time at all for them boys was completely out of arrows. And still, Bigfoot Wallace, he just stood there. "Give me back my ponies." It was the strangest thing them Indians had ever seen. They was out of ammunition. They didn't want those ponies that bad. They hightailed it out of there. Probably didn't stop running until they got all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Don't you know, Bigfoot Wallace He waited a bit to see if they was going to come circling back. They didn't. He began to let those strings loose from around his sleeves and his pant cuffs. All them hickory nuts fell out, and they was plumb shelled, ready to eat they were. He got onto White Beam, gathered up all them ponies and hauled them back to his cabin. He waited a few hours till the sun was up good and he could see. He went right on back down there to that clearing, and he had a couple of sheets with him and some covers, and he laid them on the ground. He scraped up all of those shelled hickory nuts. He took them right back to his cabin to feed his hogs. Now, I can't tell you for sure whether that's a true story or not, but I believe it is because, Big Foot Wallace, the way they tell me, everything he does is over the top. You can find out more about Big Foot Wallace if you want to, but I hope you enjoyed the story. Big Foot Wallace and the Hickory Nuts. Thank y'all.